regretted that you didn't have a bit more time to address all the issues that you were aware of, that you had in mind to talk about. So I wondered whether you just want to take a few minutes just to draw out any or flag up any other aspects that you'd like to talk about, or certainly point to this evening.
Two come to mind. I'll start with the first one.
That sounds good.
And that is that it's also bringing awareness to the fact that we all have prejudices, and to just push that away, to negate that, again, is not necessarily going to help you go forward and grow and develop. So my suggestion is to mind your butt, to look at your butt. So what I mean by this is that quite often you get those sayings, don't you? I'm not prejudiced, but, and then usually some expression of deeply held prejudice is put forward. So be honest with that, I mean, for example, so that's minding your butt, So, for example, I've been going to the States regularly, and it's not unusual for people to say, well, I'm not prejudiced, but Americans, they can be, so it's sort of even like that, So be honest. I mean, prejudice means to prejudge. And of course, that is another aspect of ignorance and even fear, perhaps. And so it's acknowledging that and using that as an opportunity to go deeper and unpack that within yourself. Because it's easy, again, for us to say, well, it's those people over there that are prejudiced, and from their prejudice, they discriminate and they act upon those prejudices. But we all have our prejudices. So that was one thing that came to mind. The other thing which I wanted to express was part of the reason why I moved to Bristol was I identified it as a conscious city, and that there is a kind of a real sense of awareness of what for me are important issues. There's a great deal of, for example, vegetarian and veganism here. There's a real sense of commitment to community and localism. There's a commitment to co-working. There's loads of yoga. There's a lot of interest, in meditation and spirituality. Even around our Buddhist center, there are 4 Buddhist centers within 15-20-minute walk. And but also it's clearly a radical city. I mean, I was listening to Alia, who's somebody that I occasionally listen to, who's somebody who talks about Black issues as such. And I was reminded that, there's a program on Channel 4, on BBC 4 this morning, where they were talking about riots. And I was reminded that the series of riots in the 80s and 90s, they started in Bristol. There's the St Paul's riots, which eventually led to various other riots around the country, for example, in Brixton. And so there is a kind of dynamism here. And, you've got the People's Republic of Stokes Croft. And Stokes Croft, there's places there which they're very much interested in helping all aspects of society, whether you live on the streets, whether you're an addict. And so it's kind of no coincidence that on the, or let me put it another way, it was part of those conditions, I think, which led to the toppling of the statue. I mean, whether you agree with it or not, it's, and when Sechalila called me to ask me to give the talk, I just was cycled back from the place where the statue had been, and very much there was a real sense there that something significant had happened.
Mm.
And it's also interesting that the police chose to stand back and let those events happen, and because they realized that it could have accelerated things even more and created more violence. Although there was an attack on a piece of property, there was no violence towards any other people there.
Mm.
And already we've seen how that has been a catalyst for so many other things. And even in Bristol, they've taken down even more signs and things like that. And I think that, again, I'll express my own personal opinion, that to understand the oppression of minorities who have been alienated and separated from a meaningful democratic process, you can see how that arises, because various democratic processes went ahead and they refused to take down the sign. They even refused to put up, as Shredder Lochley was saying earlier, to put up something which gave information of a context of the suffering which had come from that. So I feel very proud to be living in Bristol and being amongst that creative energy as such, where the people spoke, they've been alienated from the democratic process, and this was their rage, if you like, in a very sort of creative way, in a sense, because they symbolically pushed that statue. And we all know, I mean, most people outside of Bristol don't realise how far that statue was pushed to get to that point of the water by that bridge, which apparently is named after a particular slave, and to throw that into the water like many slaves had been thrown into the water. So those are two kind of things which came to mind.
Thanks, Advayamati. Yeah. I appreciate just giving you a bit of space to open that up again. So the other thing that I really thought seemed quite important, I just wonder whether you could say, we again in our conversation, you talked about the threefold ignorance. And I thought that was a really important point. And I'd really just invite you just to sort of fill that out very briefly, if you could. I mean, I think it's right straightforward, but I think it's worth raising as a point of interest, in particularly when we're looking to, well, I suppose for me, a sense that just from last week, my own sense of really needing to educate myself. And I think my sense as well that I think it would be really helpful for us as a community to educate ourselves as a Sangha. And I think it would be really great to do that before we head off into any actions. I think our actions need to come from educating ourselves.
And this brings another point which I didn't quite emphasize last week, that clearly education is a fundamental thing. We all need to educate ourselves. And I spent most of my adult life educating others and educating teenagers, where I taught religious education, and it was very, very important for me to teach them about the origins of prejudice and discrimination. And I would show them all kinds of films, Bend It Like Beckham, Malcolm X, and I felt that it was important that they had some kind of understanding of the history. And so the three ignorances, I spoke of two last week, and then I reflected and wanted to emphasize the third. So the first ignorance, and I link them to the three poisons of the Dharma and Buddhism, of greed, hatred, and delusion. Most of our motivations come from those three aspects, or a combination of. Human beings can be quite creative, as we see. And so there is, ignorance one, as you say, which is ignorance means to not know. And it's connected to the word gnosis and jnana, and because Sanskrit is an Indo-European language, jnana and gnosis are connected, and so kenosis is not knowing. Is knowledge, and so ignorance is not knowing something. So you could, I'm not great on scientific knowledge. So, and, I've been reading the biography of Einstein, and I have to skip quite a lot of it because I can only go so far with my knowledge and understanding of that. And so if we don't know something, we don't know something, and we can choose then to educate ourselves. And the second type of ignorance that I spoke about, which I felt particularly could involve all three of the poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion, was willful ignorance, deciding that you don't want to know about something, or you're closed in your way of thinking. And this can be. This was actually emphasized on Sunday when they attempted to interview the people who'd gone to defend the memorial, and they didn't really. They just had a very limited idea of why they were there. Some of them didn't know why they were there, apart from that they wanted to defend a certain idea of Britishness, and perhaps even under that, the idea of white British culture that they were seeking to defend. But they weren't willing to open up to different points of view. And we know this when we try to have a conversation with some people, and it's accentuated online these days with Twitter and things like that, where there is a polarization, where people are not listening, people are not open to different points of view. So they're willfully not wanting to know different aspects or knowledge or why things have arisen, or they're selective with that. So that was the second one, and my reflection on the third one is implicit in the others, what I've said, but just to be clear, that the third ignorance is ignorance of the Dharma, not knowing the nature of reality, or not opening up to the teachings of the Dharma therein.
Great, thanks, Advayamati. I actually was very interested in that one, particularly that last one. That it feels very important that we try to frame our conversations, our exploration of this sensitive area, important but sensitive area, within the Dharma, so that it actually gives us that kind of holding context for our education. So thanks for drawing that out again. I think I'm aware of the time, but just like to if you could, I think it'd be helpful just to say a little bit again around this sense of this relating. You kind of you seem to suggest that it was important to reflect on the Heart Sutra, and you were talking about your own use of that text and how helpful that has been. And it's relating back to this sense of the kind of the impact of othering. I wonder whether you just aware that it's probably quite a big topic to ask you to open up and close down in just a few minutes, but I thought it was worth just inviting you just to say a little bit about this sense of how this our capacity for othering is bound up with this sort of denial of interdependence and conditionality.
I think you've summed it up very well then.
Oh, well, that's that then.
Well, just to say that we talk about the ego, and we all know that we can be ego-centered. We can see the world through our own ego, and the Heart Sutra and the Dharma in general is about going beyond self, is about going beyond the ego, and it's seeking. There is a tendency, and I've had this in the past myself. I've read lots of books about the Dharma, and I've read lots of books about different world religions, and I've seen myself have that tendency to want to acquire lots of knowledge without really having equivalent understanding. And as my Dharma practice has gone on, I've followed one of the well, I see one of the most important sayings from Sangha, and that's more and more of less and less. And so rather than just accumulating lots of knowledge and understanding, I've sought to try and go deeper into key, up to 10 things, 10 key things that help me actually to go beyond ego, and to help me with my bringing my Dharma practice into everyday life. And we can have a tendency to overcomplicate it. And people say to me, oh, it's not as simple as that. And my response quite often is, well, actually, it is as simple as that sometimes. But we allow our thought process, our emotions, our feelings to cover it with complications. And sometimes we just have to stop certain ways of thinking, certain ways of acting, and certain ways of being. And again, because that's opening us up to the nature of reality of non-separation, the transcending of the subject, object, self, other dichotomy.
Yeah.
It's as simple as it is profound.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Advayamati. So I'm aware of the time.
Yep.
So we're going to have a break very shortly. Is there anything else you would like to add before we change the modes, Advayamati?
Just to say thank you, everyone, that people have engaged with this area and topic, because it's not just me spouting off. I think as it's this again, there's been these set of conditions that are allowing us as a community to really be proactive and to open up to more diversity even in our own centre. What can we do as a community to be more inclusive? And there's so much creativity amongst everybody present and those that come to the centre. So it's a wonderful opportunity for us to use this energy that we have around us. In the last week, Bristol has been the centre of the universe. And so let's use this in a creative way for meaningful action.
Great. Thank you very much, Advayamati. So we're going to have a break shortly. So just on that last point that Advayamati was making, I'd just like to tell you that Advayamati, we have been talking in the centre team, and this over the last week particularly, of course, this has been very much come to the fore, that we are very much behind and wish to do some outreach work, and Advayamati and Jyoti will be looking at that for the future. So it's not something that we can do straight away, and that's kind of going to be a separate conversation at some point within the Sangha. But for tonight, we'd like to set that aside as a separate project. And of course, we're not in a position to do that at present anyway, but certainly just want to flag up before we go into questions or observations that's very much in our mind. I think for me, I think others in the centre, our main focus we feel key at the moment is this thing of education. We think it's really the way forward for us as a Sangha is to really educate ourselves first before we try to make any moves into the community. I think, I don't know where this came up, but I think one of my anxieties is that we perpetuate colonialism. If we think we know, we have the knowledge, and we're going to go out into the world and impose our knowledge onto another culture, I think we, I feel very strongly we don't want to perpetuate that. Yes, I'm kind of just wanted to flag that up, that really want to emphasize our need for education. So Advayamati's just put one little thing up on the chat box already. In terms of education, look at a documentary called The 13th. Sounds very interesting. But, let's stop there, if that's okay. So the invitation now is that we'll have a 10-minute space. We'll keep everyone muted to sort of hold the energy and the focus. And the invitation is, if you feel moved to write any questions or observations you have into the chat box, and we will try to, when we kind of restart in 10 minutes time, hopefully we'll be able to address some of those questions or observations. So yeah, very much looking forward to what you're going to be posting. And when we come back, Satchalila will be passing the questions to Advayamati and myself, and we'll try to respond to them. If I could, yes, Satchalila has just put up the Dana Bowl. So if I could just remind you, of course, in this space, it would be really helpful as ever if in this little gap, if you were able to make any donations to the centre. There's a link in the chat box, and that would really help us to continue to be able to facilitate these sort of spaces, these events. So see you shortly. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're there's quite a lot of questions coming up, and I'm choosing to avoid looking at them too much detail right now.
Okay.
But I think it would be, maybe we could, that's all right, we'll make a start,
Yeah.
starting to sort of respond to some of the questions that have been raised.
I was thinking there's an interesting pair of questions. So Anna was asking, how would you suggest one go beyond ego? And then Claire Shah was asking, how do you know when you're going beyond transcending ego, when you're just bypassing? I wondered if that might be two that we could bring together and briefly explore big areas.
Sorry, would you mind saying them again? Just my brain's trying to catch up there.
Yeah.
Piece them together.
Yeah. So Anna is asking us, how do we begin to go beyond ego in this context? And right. Claire had a related question about, when are we actually going beyond ego, and when are we just bypassing?
Right.
Spiritually bypassing.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Shall I start with the first one? How would you suggest one go beyond ego? Well, my initial response was mindfulness, meditation, spiritual friendship, and what we call the altruistic dimension, just sort of doing things for others, and of course there's also the balance of knowing when to do things for others and when to look after yourself type thing. But few of us are in danger of doing too much for others, although it can happen. So I think it's a constant development of mindfulness, which can involve meditation, but mindfulness should be an everyday thing, an every moment to moment thing. Spiritual friends, I think, are essential with helping us to and pointing out to us when we are maybe being unskillful, and being supportive. I think it's important also to know that as a community we are sharing our struggles. Few of us are Buddhas. We are Buddhists, so we're kind of Buddhas in training. So it's sharing that struggle, and of course, in the words of Ali G, keeping it real.
Thanks. Yeah. So I think I'd add to it, and to sort of bring in Claire's question. I think a sense of, I think one of the ways I think we can tell whether or not the ego is involved is really clocking what happens to us when our actions aren't received in the way that we expect them to be received, or have the effect that we want them to have. If we find ourselves starting to get tight, or start to grip around our desired outcome, we can be fairly certain that our ego is in some way involved in what we're trying to, although there may be good motivations there. When we start to grip around it and not just freely give as best we can, if we find ourselves starting to lock and binding around that, then we can be sure that the ego is present. I think the other thing I would say is always, and Advayamati is very good at this, very clear on this, is this sense of being embodied in our practice. The more we're in our bodies and responding on that deeper level of heart connection, there's much less likely that the mind, which is where the ego really resides in the sort of constructs of the mind, then as long as we're the more we can be embodied in our responsiveness, it's more likely that we will be being limited or defined by our ego.
Okay, would you like another question?
I can't see either.
Bring it on, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know, I felt a bit of a resonance between, again, two comments. Kema Jyoti said, I'm very interested in awareness of other in terms of a traditional Buddhist practice, which partly answers the previous question. And then Juliet has mentioned how she keeps coming across this comment that silence is violence in relation to Black Lives Matter. What would a dharmic perspective on this be? Can you separate your own perspective and emotions, particularly when you witness suffering? So something about awareness of other and this, silence is violence. Is that a phrase you both come across, and do you have a sense of a dharmic perspective on that?
Well, I think if it's all right, Advayamati, I'll have a go at the second part of that question. Silence is violence. I think it goes back to what I was trying to suggest earlier in the evening, that I do think that we really need to educate ourselves first before we try to act. And I think that so actually silence in the sense of actually just giving ourselves time to learn, to explore our responses, to give that sort of space for some congruent action to arise within us seems to be important. One of the phrases that I thought might be, I'm kind of interested in this area, another phrase from Sangharakshita, which is beware of premature synthesis. And I think in this, so in terms of remaining silent, in a way, we remain silent until we have synthesized our experience and our understanding for long enough to be able to act from with a degree of, as I say, congruence. I don't know if that's sufficient as a response, but that's my.
Can I say something?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, and the importance of the twofold path of developing wisdom and compassion, and the wonderful symbol of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva with 1,000 arms, and there are arms reaching out to the person where they are at, and knowing how to do that. In the middle of the hand, there is an eye. It's the eye of wisdom, and the Buddhist term for this is upaya, skillful means, knowing when to act, when not to act, and how to be appropriate to an individual person. And it's not always easy. There's if you a couple of times this week when I cycled down near the bridge, the famous bridge now at the harbour side, there's a young girl who sleeps on the street there. She's obviously suffering from either addiction or mental health issues, and my heart just opens up. It just goes out to her. It makes me cry. And I don't always know what's the right thing and response to that. Whether I should give her money, whether I should buy her a cup of coffee, whether I should talk to her. And that's our own individual sort of path, really, knowing how we can respond appropriately to the suffering in the world.
Mm. Great. Yeah. I suppose so there's the image of Avalokiteshvara. I think the other, I suppose there's something about, well, obviously we have the metta practice, which is central to everything that we do, and how that that capacity to develop the heart so that we naturally can find this empathic connection, which is the means really to to reduce that sense of other. Actually, through empathy, we resonate, we vibrate with each other. There's a sense of interconnectedness through that practice. So I think that's within the same area. I'm aware, actually, you're going to sort of thread in the next question, but just to flag up that I did notice that I read somebody saying, can we express opinions? Yes, sorry, I should have made that clear. It's opinions and questions. So, but obviously it will just be, they'll read out. It won't be, we haven't, well, at present, we're thinking we'll just continue in this form at the moment. We still seem to have quite a bit to get through, but certainly if you have an opinion that you'd like to be kind of shared with the whole group, then just write it into the chat box, and actually I'm sure we'll be able to share that with the group.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a question that Taranita raised last week, which is a bit resonant with one that Advayamati's raised this week. So last week, Taranita's reiterated it this week. When do you think it's okay? Is there a point when it's okay to break the law in pursuit of a cause? The way Advayamati's put it, I agree that we all have prejudice that we need to raise our awareness about. When prejudice is used with power to the detriment of others, or is institutionalized, is there a place for fierce love to stop others from harming themselves or others? So I think that they're both in that kind of area of how do we judge? I mean, there's that saying of Healy, isn't there? You've listened long enough, now strike your note. Yeah. So go on. Yeah.
So to the second Advayamati's point, I would say yes. and again, it's knowing when to and how to bringing the wisdom for that fierce love, which of course links to Taranita's question. And I think that, and this is a personal opinion, and in a way there are aspects of the Buddha's life where he did fight against injustice, not least his kind of rejection of the caste system, for example, or that was prevalent in the time. And so the caste system was, you know, it was enshrined in the laws of the day as such, but he rejected them. And so some laws are not just, and I think we need to fight against them, but not in a violent way, not anything that involves violence against other individuals, for sure. But yes, we certainly do need to challenge laws. I mean, as you know, at a certain point, it was illegal for women to vote. It was illegal for black people to vote, and illegal in the States up until the end of the 60s for black people to walk on a certain type, on a certain area or part of the road. The Rolling Stones, when they were touring, they had a black keyboard player, Billy Preston. He still wasn't allowed to go in the main door of the hotel. He had to go around in the service entrance. So there is a time to challenge and to fight unjust laws. And I was looking at how this idea of legality was turned on its head by Martin Luther King, by people standing up for justice and deciding that they'd go to prison instead of being not allowed to sit on a certain part of bus or something like that. They would go to prison. They were breaking the law at that time. But eventually they managed to challenge this whole thing of what was legal or not at that time.
I suppose just to add on to that response, is something around intentionality. So as we know in Buddhism, so ethical practice is based upon intention. So I think for me it's very important that if the choices that we make are informed, or that we are conscious of what is our intention behind our actions. And although of course it doesn't imply that we can just do anything we want, it's certainly that kind of really being clear on what's driving our actions seems to be a very helpful part of the Dharma teaching, to avoid harm, really. You know, we may be acting, wanting to do something helpful, but in fact creating harm. And in terms of this phrase, fierce love, which I think is a great phrase, thank you, Tricia, for naming that. Yeah, I think, of course, we have the wrathful deities, the wrathful figures within Buddhist iconography, which is this a real, well, these are kind of representations of the heart burning, wanting to really sort of break through ignorance, which is after all what one of the key things that we are working with. So yeah, I think it's that energy can be really helpful, but we need to be sensitive how we use it, of course. Okay.
Yeah, Kerry's got a question. How do we tackle, from a Buddhist perspective, the idea that's proliferated to discredit people, to say that Black and minority ethnic communities and individuals choose a victim status? I mean, she's wondering if there's anything from Dr. Ambedkar that would support us in this, but generally, is there a way that we can tackle this idea, that's put about, that, yeah, people are choosing a victim status?
I'm afraid, to be honest, Kerry, I have no idea on how to answer that one. I don't know enough about Ambedkar to be able to answer that question. I think it's an important one. I think, so I'm sorry, I don't feel I'm able to answer that. I think I suppose I for myself, I think there's an opposite side of it, which possibly we could, which I kind of can feel in myself, and possibly is a sort of mirror in some way, is that the sense of finding it difficult to know how to go forward because of being kind of incapacitated in some way on the basis of experiencing guilt. I feel there's a connection there. Looks as if Kama Jyoti's frowning there. I can see you, Kama Jyoti. But anyway, maybe that suggests that's a bit of a going off piste a bit. So maybe I'll just hold back there. But that's my only take. I'm sorry, I haven't got enough.
Can I clarify the question? That you're saying that there are some criticisms of ethnic minorities because they've become victims. Is that right? Well, again, that's just such an ignorant assertion, not knowing the years of oppression and suffering that people have gone through, and that what they've had to do to survive. In many cases, they've had to shut up to survive. Otherwise, if they say something, they are considered aggressive or I can find myself getting quite annoyed actually by it, so I have to calm myself down. But it is basically an ignorance of not knowing where people have been to get to here, where they've gone through a process of generational trauma, where hundreds of years of oppression, where many women were raped by the plantation owners, yeah, and the feelings that must bring down the lines, where they don't have any redress for justice in any way. And when slavery was banned in this country, they didn't compensate the slaves, they compensated the slave owners. 46,000 slave owners in this country were compensated when they banned slavery. So when you're faced with that kind of thing, and to talk about victim mentality, it's quite insulting actually. And so I really do recommend this book, why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, because it does bring up many of those issues. And that documentary, which I recommended, 13th, which looks at the development of the criminalization of black people in the States, and reinforced by policies by various presidents, and willfully so associating, and that crucial point where drugs in the 70s and 80s, instead of looked at as a health, social welfare issue, was criminalized. And from then they developed the warehousing of people, and developed they built more and more prisons to house people. So at the beginning of the documentary, it says that America is 5% of the world's population, but has 25% of the world's prisoners. And of course, we know that quite a majority of those are black and ethnic minorities. Education, yeah.
Thank you. I'd just like to say, Advayamati, actually, I really I appreciate seeing your energy coming up then as you were beginning to talk. This actually feels really important that that's visible. It feels like it really, I just feel that sort of heart opening towards you when you start talking from that place with real passion and energy. I think it's personally, yeah, I want to yeah, acknowledge that. Yeah, feels important to find a way to yeah, to make space for that, and for it to be witnessed. It feels important.
Well, the positive aspect of what's been going on is the recent rising in consciousness of these issues, and that's the exciting thing, really, is that I'm learning a lot more, and hopefully everybody else is learning a lot more about the deeper issues and the conditions that have led to this.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, we had another question from Claire, not Claire Shaw, our other Claire, and I'm wondering if there's more following on from that, coming with Claire's question. What conditions are needed to increase understanding? And Darman was saying he'd like us to have groups that will allow us each to process our part in privilege and racism. I wonder if there's something around that about how we increase our understanding, how we, we become aware of what we're doing more. Anything you'd say about that?
Again, it's education, isn't it? If you look at the, I mean, the book that I've recommended, somebody else recommended another book, which sounds interesting, the White Fragility. And if you go onto the Black Lives Matter website, or, I mean, once you start looking, there's so much out there. It's just that we haven't bothered to look, or haven't felt the need to look. And now even on Netflix and all the other platforms, they're having special sections for these documentaries, which we can learn a lot from. And so I mentioned Arlika, who's a black British guy who talks a lot, gives a very different perspective. He's done a lot of research about statistics and conditions, and it's very interesting hearing what he has to say, and others like him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to say quickly, one of his key points is a lot of things are said about black people, for example, the criminalization. And he said, actually, it's not about color, it's about class. That most of the issues come from poverty and from the working class, because it's amongst the white working class as well. It's just that it's emphasized, and he calls it gaslighting. So it's quite strong stuff. But again, once you start unpacking it, it's very, very interesting.
Thanks, Advayamati. I'd just like to add that as a centre, we will be talking about. We've got a meeting of the sort of council and trustees of the centre in just over a week's time, and we will be looking at how we can move forward in our education. Will be on the agenda for that meeting, and I very much hope we find a constructive way to really engage and make use of this. It feels like a real opportunity. It feels like, as Advayamati is saying, there's a shift in consciousness, which I really hope we can make use of and really kind of go with. It just feels such a rare opportunity. So yeah, and we hope, of course, that will then feed, that we will be able to feed that and invite people into that process in the way, within the Sangha. For you, Darman. So it will be there.
So, ready for a completely different question?
Okay.
So Michelle's written, there's been a video on Facebook lately of a woman in France that wears a blindfold and offers hugs to everyone. When lockdown is over, myself and Lucy Bray said we'd love to do this in the middle of town. What do you think of this as an action, Advayamati and Bhadra?
It's lovely, yeah. I don't think we do enough, do we? You know, next door to us is the church, and every Wednesday when I walk past, they are offering food, free food for people. Yeah, the Sikhs go out and offer food to langar, to the homeless, and I know that some other Buddhists, you know, they go out and meditate on the street, but yes, getting out there, being a positive sphere of influence. A Buddha field is a positive sphere of influence, and I'd like to think that, you know, as a Buddhist center, we do that on a certain level. But there is so much more that we can do, and just being, you know, on one level, being transforming our mental states, being more positive, open and interested people, that has an effect. But there is so much more that we can do, and it's using that creativity and the skills that we have. And if you have the skill of giving hugs to random people blindfolded, that's great. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it has an effect, as does the metta practice. It has an effect. It's a simple magic.
Sounds good to me. That's what I'd say.
I might be first in the queue. I haven't had a hug for 3 months.
So we had another question from Tarnita. What would you say to nationalist Buddhist monks in Myanmar or Sri Lanka or anywhere else?
Stop being violent.
I think we give them a hug. Yeah. It just feels like that. Somehow just trying to really meet them, express that basic human contact, and get them down into the kind of heart of Buddhist practice. It's that's what it feels like. It feels like there's somewhere the Dharma's got misplaced. It's been overridden by other, we might, you know, social or ego needs. So it's trying to, I think, in terms of engagement, it would be a matter of trying to get back to a sort of a more human level, a human and Dharma level of connection with.
Thank you. So Yasmin has a question. How could she or we use any platform of privilege that we have, like whiteness, to lend our support to causes such as Black Lives Matter, whilst also remaining sensitive to not pulling the focus away from those who have the actual lived experience, making sure we're giving the support that's actually needed rather than what we perceive? I think she was picking up on what you'd said, Bhadra, about the colonialism can kind of happen. Yeah.
Well, I kind of feel like I'm on a bit of a treadmill of just going around saying the same thing again. But I would say, you know, I think in answer to Yasmin, I do think it requires education primarily. I think it's, I think that's where I'd go with that.
And solidarity, that you know, just seeing that and the protests, that there was black and white people were walking together, being together, and it does feel culpably different this time. You know, people are educating themselves, they're getting involved. You know, in previous riots that I've lived through, you know, Brixton, Notting Hill, poll tax, they tended to be, you know, sort of just a sort of monocultural. It tended to be the black people protesting and saying they've not had enough. Whereas this time, there seems to be a different consciousness, that people are using their skills, talents, education to help others in this cause.
So we've another question from Juliet. What would you say if you had a chance to meet the human being who killed George Floyd? What would you say?
I don't know what you could say, really, because I think he's obviously somebody who is in the category of being willfully ignorant. It's also, from what I have read, they knew each other. He knew him. So it was a willful act. George was a bouncer in a nightclub where the particular officer frequented, and there'd been tension between them in the past because he wasn't, he had to be spoken to about his behaviour in the nightclub. So it was clearly premeditated. And I mean, I'd like to think that I could talk to him. I'd like to think that he would reflect and see the errors of his ways. But yeah, I'd have to think a lot more about that. And I'd also have to really open up on a deeper level to compassion, to what led him to feel so fearful, to feel so angry, to feel so that way that they could take the life of another human being in that way. It's beyond my comprehension in many ways. As I said last week, I had enough trouble trying to understand why people were unpleasant to me and others when I went to primary school. And I still kind of maintained a sense of that by and large. And I still cannot fathom how one person can kill another, apart from the fact that I will say I'm not a pacifist. That I do think it's important to defend myself, and my son is 22 now. But if anyone was to harm him, I would be willing to kill them to stop doing that. But then I'd have to I'd have to face the consequences of those actions. That is, I'm not a pacifist, but I do believe in non-violence.
Thank you. How are we doing? It's 5 to 9. One or two more?
I just wonder whether it might be worth trying to get a sense of where we are as a whole group before we do any more. I'm kind of aware there's been quite a huge amount of content in the last 3/4 hour or so, and there's more content on the chat. So for us to sort of delve into at some point. So. Perhaps you could just put your hand up if you are full right now. Yeah. I can't see you all, but it looks like there's a few of you still up for a bit more.
Can I say something?
Well, we were trying not to do that, Nalini. I would love to hear you, but if we open it up to you, we're going to have to open it up to everybody. So,
well, I put something in the chat.
Okay. Well,
so I like to get if it could be mentioned. Thank you.
All right. So yeah, my sense is maybe one or two more points, or if there's any just observations that come in as a way of starting to close down. So if you wouldn't mind just mentioning what Nalini felt quite strongly you'd like to have raised.
So Nalini's point was about misuse of power and authority. That was the
Right.
the point.
Yes, power corrupts.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and Kerry asked, is there a risk of thinking we need to know everything before acting and therefore we don't act?
Well, I think that's a fair point, Kerry. And so I'm realizing I have been stressing that. And yes, I don't think we have to be all knowing before we go forward. But I do think, well, certainly for myself, I feel I need I need more understanding, knowledge before I can, personally, I feel I'd know what to do that would be effective. So that's, yeah, that's where I am with that. But yes, I take your point. I certainly don't, I feel there's a degree of urgency with this, what's happening here. So I'd really like to kind of find some way of harnessing that, this moment in some way. So yeah, there's certainly a sense of urgency, I think.
Advayamati, anything else to add on that?
I think, yes, and also just again being aware of intentionality and positive mental states, acting from positive mental states. I mean, having said that, there is a time to act from anger. Anger can be a very good way of helping us move forward and seeing things from a different point of view. But I think it's also important to act with a skillfulness and therefore making sure that it is double checking that it's with a positive mental state.
Thank you. So as a sort of concluding thought, Shradalakshmi had asked quite early on, specifically responding to Advayamati, whether he could share with us his 10 simple phrases or ideas or teachings that fit into Bante's more and more of less and less. And then maybe that's something we could invite you to do in another forum, Advayamati. Maybe you could contribute something that we could share through the mailing. But I wanted to put you and Bhadra right on the spot and imagine, okay, we're on a desert island. You had 10, 9 of them have been washed away. And just right at this moment, wouldn't be the same every day, every moment, but right at this moment, if you had one of those phrases or teachings that really sums up that more and more of less and less for you right now, what would it be?
For me, the past is gone, the future an idea. There is only now. Although now doesn't exist. Further reflection, which if I was on a desert island, I'd obviously have time to
Make space to find the heart response.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for fielding that flurry of questions. Very much appreciated. And as you were saying, Bhadra, I think there was a sense sometimes, oh yeah, we're going around, we're coming back to the offering the same answers to different questions, which perhaps is also something for us to reflect on going forward from this. Do either of you want to say anything else before we conclude the evening?
Well, I'd just like to say thank everyone for their patience. I'm aware that this puts, we're talking about power. This is, we've taken a position, or this has limited your capacity. This mode that we've chosen this evening has obviously limited your capacity to sort of have a more kind of fluid conversation. But I think that's the sort of the nature of the beast. But I hope it's been helpful, and I hope it's it's another step forward in our aspirations to learn and make use of this time.
Thank you. It's some great questions, and obviously people are feeling it and thinking about what's going on, and it's lovely to share that. And I mean, I don't have all the answers. I'm struggling as well. I'm learning new things. I'm listening to things every day. But I do want us to galvanize our energies and galvanize our ideas and our actions. So let's do something rather than just talking about it. That's my feeling. So I have offered to coordinate this. So do feel free to let's make a list of what we feel that we can offer, and if you like to be involved, and ideas and things like that. Yes, do contact me. How should we do this, Sachalila? Should I give out my personal email address, or should we do it through the centre? What do you think?
Well, the centre email address is, I mean, you're welcome to give out your personal email address if you want, but we have info@bristolbuddhistcentre.org, which is where you can always find us, and that can find its way to whoever. If you have any comments or things that you want to post into the chat, either about how the evening's gone or ways that you'd like to offer to help, the chat is saved. So also we have a note of that there that we can share. So it's up to you really, whatever's easiest for you.